The prestigious Huntington Academy in Washington, D.C., was known for its rigorous academic standards, its elite student body, and an unspoken rivalry between its professors and certain political families. Dr. William Hastings, a tenured professor of calculus, had made quite a reputation for himself over the years, not just as a brilliant mathematician but also as an outspoken liberal who loved making examples of students from conservative backgrounds. To him, students were more than just learners, they were representatives of ideologies. And as much as he loved the challenge of molding young minds, he despised students who came from families he deemed as privileged, ignorant, and undeserving. So, when he saw Barron Trump listed for his Advanced Calculus 2 course, his eyes gleamed with opportunity. "This is going to be interesting," he muttered to himself. By now, Barron was 18 years old, towering at 6 feet 7 inches, a reserved but sharp-minded individual. Despite the public assumptions that he was nothing more than a privileged kid with famous parents, those who knew him well understood that Barron was different. He had a natural gift for numbers, problem-solving, and logical reasoning, traits that had been nurtured in private. However, he had kept his talents mostly low-profile to avoid unnecessary attention. For Dr. Hastings, however, Barron was just another Trump, a name he resented. He imagined the young man would be arrogant, entitled, and incapable of surviving a truly intellectual environment. He couldn't wait to expose what he assumed was an academic fraud hiding behind his last name. The first encounter. On the first day of the semester, students filled into the grand lecture hall, taking their places. Barron, dressed in a crisp navy suit jacket over a casual turtleneck, walked in without saying a word and took a seat in the middle row. He wasn't trying to be noticed, but his sheer presence was enough to turn heads. Dr. Hastings strode into the room, his graying hair combed back neatly, adjusting his glasses as he took a sip of his black coffee. He glanced at the roster and smirked. "Ah, Mr. Trump, I see we have a celebrity in our midst." A few students chuckled nervously. Barron simply nodded, his face unreadable. Dr. Hastings turned to the chalkboard and, with a dramatic flair, wrote a complex integral equation that spanned nearly half the board. It wasn't just a difficult problem, it was a notoriously unsolvable problem that even professionals struggled with. "Since we are in an advanced class, I expect my students to be prepared for high-level thinking," he declared. "Mr. Trump, since you come from a family that believes in winning, let's see if you can win against this problem. Why don't you solve it for us?" The class fell silent. Barron stood up calmly, walked toward the board, and examined the equation with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through Hastings. "Take your time," Hastings said, smirking. "If you need help, I'm sure your father can tweet about it for assistance." A few students laughed. Barron, however, showed no reaction. Instead, he picked up the chalk, rolled it between his fingers, and then, without hesitation, began solving the equation with smooth, confident strokes. Dr. Hastings' smirk began to fade. Barron worked methodically, his movements precise, his calculations flawless. Within 3 minutes, the equation, one that Hastings had deliberately chosen to be unsolvable, was solved perfectly. The room fell into stunned silence. Barron placed the chalk down and turned to face the professor. "You made a miscalculation in your setup," Barron said calmly. "The way you structured the integral suggests that it has no elementary solution. But if you apply a modified Laplace transform and use contour integration in the complex plane, you actually get a finite result. I wrote out the steps in case anyone needs clarification." The class sat frozen. Dr. Hastings' face turned a deep shade of red. Barron returned to his seat, indifferent to the gasps and whispers around him. Dr. Hastings cleared his throat. "Well, that was unexpected." But inside he was fuming. "This isn't over." Dr. Hastings clenched the edge of his podium, trying to mask his embarrassment with a forced chuckle. He had expected Barron to struggle, to stutter, to be exposed as an intellectual lightweight. Instead, the young man had effortlessly solved a problem that even seasoned mathematicians hesitated to touch. "All right," Hastings said, adjusting his glasses. "Perhaps I underestimated you, Mr. Trump, but let's see if you can keep up." The class moved on, But Hastings couldn't shake his frustration. He had spent years proving his intellectual superiority over students, particularly those from conservative or elite backgrounds. He prided himself on being the smartest person in the room. Barron Trump, of all people, wasn't supposed to humiliate him like this. That night, Hastings sat in his dimly lit office, swirling his coffee as he devised a plan. If he's as smart as he thinks he is, let's see how he handles real academic warfare, he muttered. The next day, Hastings returned with a strategy. Target Barron's weaknesses. Every genius had one. Publicly challenge him. If Barron struggled under pressure, his reputation would crumble. Make it personal, push him into an emotional response. With a smug grin, Hastings waited for his next opportunity. The trap is set. 1 week later, Hastings announced a special challenge in front of the class. Mathematics is not just about numbers. It's about applying knowledge under pressure. Today I have a time test, 3 problems, 20 minutes. The first to finish with perfect accuracy gets automatic exemption from the next midterm. A murmur spread through the class. This was rare. Hastings never gave exemptions. Barron sat upright. He could sense something was off. Mr. Trump, Hastings called, smiling slyly. Since you dazzled us last week, I'm particularly excited to see how you perform under real pressure. Barron said nothing, but the gleam in his eye suggested he understood exactly what was happening. The test began. Hastings had handpicked the problems, one requiring unconventional thinking, another involving a misleading setup, and the last being outright deceptive with an intended trick solution. Most students fumbled. The difficulty level was off the charts. But Barron? He breezed through the first problem in under 3 minutes. Hastings' smile faltered. Barron solved the second with pure logic, catching the trick immediately. Now only the third problem remained. Hastings leaned forward. This was the trap, the one designed to make even the smartest students second-guess themselves. For a brief moment, Barron paused, his brow furrowing. Hastings almost grinned. Gotcha. Then, in an instant, Barron's expression changed. He picked up his pen and wrote the correct answer within seconds. He stood up, placing his test on the professor's desk. Done. A full 8 minutes ahead of the deadline. The class erupted in stunned whispers. Hastings snatched the paper, scanning it for errors. There were none. His breath hitched. Barron had not only solved the trick question, he had exposed the deception behind it by writing an additional note explaining the flaw in the problem setup. Hastings felt his stomach drop. It appears I made an error in my question, Barron said politely, but I assume that was intentional for educational purposes. The class chuckled. Hastings felt his face burn. He had set a trap, but Barron had outmaneuvered him completely. This wasn't just luck. This wasn't just talent. This was genius. And Hastings had no idea how to handle it. Dr. Hastings barely slept that night. The humiliation gnawed at him. Barron Trump had exposed his trickery in front of an entire class, and worse, he had done it with grace and precision. Hastings prided himself on being the intellectual superior in every room he entered. Now, a teenager and a Trump no less had proven otherwise. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was personal. Hastings needed to put Barron in his place, and this time he would do it in front of a much bigger audience. A calculated ambush. 2 days later, Hastings made an unexpected announcement in class. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some exciting news. Our university will be hosting the annual Mathematical Minds Symposium next week, and I have been asked to select a student for a special demonstration on advanced calculus problem solving. Students murmured with interest. The symposium was a major event, featuring some of the top mathematicians and scholars from around the country. Now, after much deliberation, I've chosen a student who has recently displayed promise. Hastings continued, his gaze locking onto Barron. Mr. Trump, I assume you won't shy away from a little challenge? The room turned silent. Barron knew exactly what this was. It was a trap. Hastings wanted to humiliate him in front of an elite audience, where the stakes were higher and the pressure unbearable. A single misstep, a single hesitation, and Hastings would destroy his reputation. Barron sat still, weighing his options. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and said in an even voice, "I accept." A flicker of triumph flashed across Hastings' face. "Excellent. I'll be choosing the problem myself, of course. It'll be something challenging." Barron gave a small nod. "I would expect nothing less." The game was on. The symposium showdown. The day of the symposium arrived. The university's grand auditorium was packed with professors, scholars, and industry experts. Hastings had made sure to invite media personnel, eager for them to witness what he believed would be Barron's public downfall. The challenge was simple. A single, complex problem would be displayed. The contestant had 10 minutes to solve it. The solution had to be verbalized in real time, demonstrating not just accuracy but also clarity of thought. It was designed for failure. Hastings approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have a unique showcase today. Our selected student, Mr. Barron Trump, will attempt to solve a calculus problem of my choosing. Let's see if his previous performances were luck or true intellect." Some in the crowd chuckled. Others watched with intrigue. Barron stepped onto the stage. His expression remained unreadable. Hastings turned to the massive screen and clicked his remote. A monstrous equation filled the display. It wasn't just difficult, it was an unsolved mathematical conjecture, a problem that had baffled even professional mathematicians. Gasps rippled through the audience. A journalist whispered, "Is this even fair?" Hastings folded his arms smugly. This was his masterstroke. But Barron? He simply smiled. Then, with complete confidence, he picked up the marker and said, "Let's begin." A hush fell over the auditorium as Barron Trump stared at the colossal equation on the screen. The problem was designed to break him, to expose him as an imposter in front of some of the sharpest mathematical minds in the country. Dr. Hastings stood off to the side, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at his lips. He had ensured that Barron's problem was unsolvable within the given time frame. There was no possible way a mere student, no matter how bright, could come up with a meaningful answer in 10 minutes. Except, Barron wasn't just any student. Taking a deep breath, he lifted his marker and began writing. "This equation is based on a conjecture regarding non-elementary integrals," Barron said, his voice clear and steady. "But the mistake in its setup is assuming that a direct solution exists in traditional calculus. Instead, let's reframe it using Laplace transforms and redefine the integral within a complex analysis framework." Murmurs spread through the audience. Some scholars leaned forward, intrigued. Others began taking notes. Hastings' smirk twitched. Barron, unfazed, continued breaking down the problem step by step. He used an alternative mathematical approach, reformulating parts of the equation in ways that many in the room had never considered before. "Now, instead of solving this traditionally, let's introduce a parametric transformation," Barron explained as his hands moved effortlessly, the marker gliding across the board. "This eliminates unnecessary terms and simplifies the integral into a solvable form." The murmurs grew louder. The experts in the audience, professors, PhD holders, mathematicians, were stunned. "Wait a minute, is he actually?" One whispered to another. "That's ingenious." Another admitted wide-eyed. Minutes passed, and Barron's work became a masterpiece of mathematical ingenuity. He had not only tackled the problem but reshaped the very way people thought about it. At the 8-minute mark, he underlined his final answer, placed the cap back on the marker, and turned to face the audience. "And that's the solution," he said simply. Dead silence. Then a single clap. Then another. And then thunderous applause. Mathematicians and scholars rose to their feet, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Even those who had entered skeptical now recognized what they had just witnessed. This kid is a genius. He just did something that professionals couldn't crack in years. Even the journalists, originally invited by Hastings to document Barron's humiliation, were now scrambling to report on his brilliance instead. Dr. Hastings? He stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched. This wasn't just a loss. This was complete and utter destruction. Barron Trump had just embarrassed him on an intellectual battlefield of his own choosing, and in front of the very people he sought to impress. Hastings felt his stomach turn. He had orchestrated a public downfall, but it wasn't Barron's. It was his own. As the applause thundered through the auditorium, Barron Trump remained composed, offering only a polite nod to the crowd. Meanwhile, Dr. Hastings stood frozen, his expression unreadable. His carefully planned trap had turned into a national spectacle, and he was the one who had walked straight into it. Barron had not only solved the impossible problem, but in doing so, he had cemented his place as a mathematical prodigy in front of some of the sharpest minds in the country. And Hastings? His reputation was in ruins. Journalists rushed forward, microphones in hand. "Mr. Trump, do you realize what you just did? Some of the greatest mathematical minds have been struggling with this for years. Will you be publishing this approach? Are you considering further studies in advanced mathematics? How long have you been working on these concepts? Where did you learn such advanced techniques?" Barron, still calm, simply replied, "I just love math. And when you love something, you find better ways to understand it." More applause. Dr. Hastings felt lightheaded. His carefully constructed persona of superiority had been shattered in an instant. He had called the press to witness Barron's downfall. Instead, they were now documenting his rise to academic stardom. But Barron wasn't done yet. Turning toward Hastings, he lowered his voice, ensuring only the professor could hear. "Dr. Hastings," Barron said smoothly, "I appreciate the challenge, but next time, if you really want to test me." He tilted his head, his blue eyes unwavering. "Make sure you understand the problem first." Hastings felt a cold sweat break across his brow. A calculated checkmate. The professor staggered back, his confidence obliterated. Barron gave a final nod, then turned and walked off the stage. The aftermath. The next day, news of the event went viral. Barron Trump shocked scholars. Outsmarts liberal professor in live math challenge. Genius unleashed. How Barron Trump solved an impossible problem in 8 minutes. Mathematics prodigy? The son of a former president stuns the academic world. Videos of the event circulated across social media, racking up millions of views. Experts analyzed his solution, praising its ingenuity. Meanwhile, Dr. Hastings disappeared from public eye. He had built his career on mocking and belittling students, particularly those from conservative backgrounds. Now, his humiliation was immortalized on the internet forever. As for Barron, he returned to class as if nothing had happened. A fellow student leaned over and whispered, "Dude, that was legendary." Barron only smiled. He didn't need to brag. The numbers spoke for themselves.